Hello, art fans. This is Scott Thompson Art. I'm your host, Scott Thompson. And in this segment, I'm going to talk a little bit about setting up a simple still life, sort of the materials you need for that, a little bit about lighting, and sort of maybe some pitfalls to avoid when doing this. So, what we have here, we have two objects starting off with. We have a synthetic apple, a synthetic pomegranate, both from just a hobby store. You can get these at like a Hobby Lobby or a Michael's. You can also go by the grocery store and pick up fresh vegetables or fresh fruit, which would be even better. But for the most part, what I've done is I've used these two elements here along with just some old drapery fabric to sort of do my backdrop. You can always choose a different fabric or just leave the tabletop exposed for the surface that your objects are sitting on, and then you get a little bit of contrast between the backdrop and the table. So what I've done, I have chosen two objects that are fairly simple. You don't want to get into doing really complicated objects. It's going to make it a little bit more difficult. Remember, this is mostly just for introductory purposes, testing your values, testing your light and shadow, blocking your objects in, and just sort of the basics of painting in general. Now, this is what a still life looks like with no directional light. The light is obviously coming from overhead, and it's left us with sort of this rinky-dink shadow here underneath. There are no shadow shapes being created on either object, which makes for a little bit of a dull painting. So what you want to do is you want to set this up in a room. You want to have a directional light, which I have, which I'll turn on in just a minute. And you want to sort of block out any outdoor lighting, any overhead lighting. You want to have one single light source when doing this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the lights off and give you an idea of what we're looking at here. It's fairly dark in the room. It's not just pitch black. We have a little bit of light source coming in sort of in this corner here from a screen door over to the left. But for the most part, this is kind of what we're looking for. So I'm going to turn on the one light source. And notice how everything has changed. Notice how we now have shadow shapes on the apple. We have a cast shadow coming off of the stem. We have form shadows on the pomegranate. In this area, we have a nice split between 70% light, sort of a middle value, and then a shadow value. I can bump the light down a little bit and make these shadow shapes a little stronger, but we have just sort of an uneven division of space. We have a nice cast shadow coming now from underneath. It's no longer sitting just underneath the objects. It's now being cast out to the right here. And a nice little accent is the reflected light coming off the pomegranate onto the apple, which creates sort of an orange tone in this area. Plus it gives the shadow on the apple a lot of illumination. Now I'm going to move this light around and let you see sort of how it shifts and how it changes and what to maybe avoid and what to maybe stick with. So this is a nice little setup as I have it here, and I will start to move the light around. We talked about overhead lighting. I'm going to show you how this changes the shadow. If you'll focus on the shadow on the ground, the light moves over, the shadows disappear, and they end up completely underneath with really no distinct shadow shapes being cast on the apple or the pomegranate. If I move behind the apple and the pomegranate, then I almost create some form of like a backlit type approach, which sometimes is very interesting. It makes for a very sort of subdued painting, which is often a nice effect. What I want to try to avoid is lighting the object directly in front, which would look like this. Because I've killed, for the most part, if I can get a little bit lower, let me see, without bumping the camera. What I've done for the most part is I have killed the shadow shapes on the front, and now I just sort of have just really flat objects. So the shadow shapes are important because they create depth and they give sort of form to what you are painting. So best to have your light source set up. I've got this sort of coming in at around a 45-degree angle, which is nice. Of course, you can experiment with the backlighting like I just previously showed you, or you can sort of do, if you wanted to kind of do something, sort of mysterious, you could maybe light it from the bottom, and that sort of gives sort of a nice effect in terms of sort of a light coming in and sort of making it sort of dark and ominous in the background. But generally starting out, you want this nice sort of directional light coming in this area. Also, it highlights the nice cast and form shadows in your drapery here in the background. Now, just a point of fact, now you can mix this up. Let me pause just a minute and just say you can mix this up. So let's say we move this one out, and I'll tell you what, let's put this one back in. Right about there is where it was. Let's move the apple out, and then we're going to put this cup in right about here. I'll move it over a little bit so you can see the handle and sort of overlap the shapes. Now, what we have here, which is a little bit more of an interesting setup, we now have a strong vertical in the cup here, and then we have a nice sort of a horizontal here. So you've sort of changed up the silhouette a little bit, and of course this handle is a nice effect as well, going from an object that's a little bit taller to one that's sort of a mid-level instead of having two objects that are pretty close in size. Now, just for compositional purposes, I have overlapped my two objects. Anytime you're working with objects, you want to sort of try to overlap the objects to some extent when you are working with them, putting them on different levels and different planes. Right now the cup is on the same level as the apple, so if I move that back just a hair, sort of in this area, now I've got objects on three different planes. And when I say planes, what I'm referring to is the base of the cup here, the pomegranate coming forward here, and then the apple sort of in the middle ground back here. What you want to try to avoid is, from a compositional standpoint, balance. You want a little more imbalance, and you want to avoid tangents. Let's talk a little bit about the balance and imbalance segment. The tabletop right here is about a about a 2/3 split, 1/3 split. You have a nice long background here, and then this comes in, and then you could probably cut it off about this area, which really breaks up the composition. You don't have balance right here in the middle. But more importantly, what you want to avoid when setting up a still life is something which looks like this right here. So what do I have that I have created? These are referred to as tangents. When one side bumps up against another side and creates this real awkward space in between. You don't even have to have the space in between. Just go ahead and bump them up together and close the space. But this is not a good thing to happen. This is why we want our objects to overlap one another. This also can be taken into consideration when working with the folds of the background. For instance, I would not want this crease right here to run into my stem this way, nor would I want this crease to run into the side of the apple like that, creating the same type of effect. That's why we want to overlap our shapes, and that gives us depth, and it makes for just a better composition in general. So, in conclusion, when you're lighting your object, let's move it back over here just a tidge. You want that nice shadow split, sort of that 70-30, this being the 30, this being the 70, and we have a, sort of a middle area ground here. A nice cast shadow. We want to avoid overhead lighting. Same thing with landscape painting. If you want to go out and you want to paint a landscape, I would recommend maybe mid-morning to mid to late afternoon, and then you'll have these nice cast shadows. If you do it at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you're going to have those overhead shadows, which just don't promote much interest and form in terms of what you have chosen to paint. So I hope this helps you out in terms of setting up your own still life at your house, and I will see you for the next segment.